Hi, my name is Geoffrey Plitt, and I'm here to talk to you guys about my top 10 secret weapons for front-end development. So thank you again to the Hub and JSLA and all of you for coming, and I'll just dive into it. So I am a stand-up comic. I'm a former Google engineer, and I went to Carnegie Mellon University, and I'm the CTO of Laughster. Laughster is a startup which is aiming to be a Pandora for comedy. We've released our first iPhone app, which you can check out. It's called Mock the Vote. It's about satire. You can check out what Republicans are laughing at, what Democrats are laughing at. I'm a back-end engineer who by necessity learned front-end engineering, and I see in the industry this trend toward this holy grail where HTML5 works everywhere, and there are exceptions to that, but the format of my talk is less of a deep dive, which I think you guys are used to, and more of a survey of a bunch of different tools. So I'm not going to wait for questions till the end because the topic tends to change every other slide. So jump in. I'm very interruptible. If you have a question, I'll take it as we go. And what I'm going to do, hopefully, is impart to you at least one or two tools that you're going to find useful, that you're going to tell your friends about, be the guy who knows about some new technology. And if anyone learns no new tools from this talk, please let me know, because then you're as cool as me. Just kidding. So I'm going to move on. I mentioned Laughster. This is just a shameless plug. We just released this week, so check it out. If you have any questions about that, I can tell you about that. We came up through the Mucker Lab incubator in Santa Monica, and the incubator experience is it's got its pros and cons, but it was cool for us. And you can pull me aside afterwards, and I can tell you a little more about that as well. So I'm going to dive into this from somewhat of a language purist's perspective, because I start by diving into CoffeeScript, and I know I'm going to alienate maybe 40% of you initially. So first let me say that sparse syntax, by that I mean the fewest lines of code, the fewest amounts of characters generally wins for me. It's not the same for everyone else, but I like a system that has the least surface area of failure. So for me, the solution with the fewest lines of code generally wins. State bags and functional design is just a small philosophical point. I generally appreciate object-oriented coding, but I also try to find ways to isolate all of the state of a system into one spot and then have a bunch of functional programming. And by that I mean as much as possible. Functions with inputs, outputs, no side effects. And I find it easier to test, easier to understand. And I'm going to move on immediately and get to the weapons. So what is Slim? It's not this guy. Slim is an HTML alternative. This is the first tool I'm going to mention. It's cool because HTML, as well-intentioned as it is, has a lot of bloat, and Slim takes a note from the Ruby world as well as the Python world in terms of indents. So this is somewhat of an opinionated, polarizing topic. We can get to it even more when I mention CoffeeScript, but assuming that you're okay with indentation style instead of a closed tag or closed brace, Slim is really fun. It's got this shorthand where the each tag is just a single word, and down below, I'm not sure if I have an example of this, but anyway, it has a shorthand that other languages like Jade or there's a variety of others have, where instead of saying div and then the attributes or content of the div, you just say dot class name or pound ID name. And there's some other things which are Ruby-ish in here, like the yield and the other parts like the unless, which if you run this on Ruby, it will interpret that way. You can also use Slim in a static context. So you can use, this is previewing a couple of other tools that I'll mention later, but you can use Middleman, CodeKit. There's a variety of other compilers for Slim. Another reason I like Slim, I should have more slides on this, but I don't, but it embeds other languages. So it uses Ruby's tilt, which lets it have a section which would say JavaScript : and then JavaScript code, or CoffeeScript : and then some CoffeeScript code. It embeds a lot of different languages, so it's sort of like a master language in a way. Any questions on that before I move on to Sass?
Why did you use Haml?
So Haml is great. I think I chose Slim because of the language the tilt aspect of embedding other languages. Haml, it was slightly just an opinion choice. Haml seemed to have percent signs that didn't need to be there. I think that's it. Are you familiar with both Haml and Slim? So does Haml have the that ability to embed other languages?
Yes.
Well, that's exciting. I might switch to Haml. That was a great question.
It's only the percent sign that we just kind of walk through.
Yeah, and Haml's more well known, so check out Haml too. I think it's a tight competitor for Slim. Any other questions on Slim? Okay. Sass. This girl digs it. Do you? Sass is an alternative for CSS. How many of you have used less or Sass? Great, most of you. So we're seeing this trend where older languages are still used and respected because of the standard, but shorthand is developed for all of the languages that we commonly use on the web platform, right? HTML alternatives. Here's a CSS alternative, and shortly I'll go into a JavaScript alternative. So the cool thing about these is that they give CSS abilities that it's always been lacking for some of us. For years we've gone, why doesn't CSS have variables? Why doesn't CSS have functions? We want to give it object-oriented properties. Well, that's what Sass does in a way. So you can see the syntax is different than typical CSS. This is a trend that some Python and Ruby people will appreciate. But even if you're not a Python or Ruby person, you may appreciate as well. The braces are taken away. It's indent style. And you can see there's imports, which, oh, they're not showing the mixins. But the mixins allow you to actually run functions and make sort of generic or parameterized versions of what CSS does. Any questions on Sass?
I think SCSS is better.
Well, isn't SCSS, this is actually something I think SCSS is a predecessor to Sass, or maybe it's an alternative syntax?
Yeah, it's basically like, I like it better because it's a drop-in for CSS. You just replace, add an S in front of the extension, and it's a valid now.
So you're saying, is SCSS a superset of CSS?
Yeah.
Now that's great. That's a cool thing. So check out SCSS as well.
I think that's the same. It's quite the same.
Yeah, I think the creators of Sass move more towards SCSS, so that you can just put in CSS into your SCSS.
Same thing with Compass. They moved away from Sass and they started writing it in SCSS, even though he likes using Sass.
So SCSS is better. My talk is out of date. This is wonderful. Now I want to talk about CoffeeScript, and there's who here has used CoffeeScript? Now, keep your hands up if you like it. And let's see who doesn't like it by taking their hands down. So I think over half the room is not a fan of CoffeeScript. I'm an opinionated guy, so I'm going to do the following. I'm not going to convince you that CoffeeScript is better. I'm just going to give you a couple anecdotes that may convince you to give it a shot. Now, first of all, I found that if someone really tries a language without braces, without closed tags, an indentation-based language like CoffeeScript, Python, some of the other things we talked about, they tend not to go back, whereas people switch from a language based on closed braces, closed parentheses, to these indentation-style languages all the time. So that's one thing. But what I find is CoffeeScript not only, sure, you'd say, all right, Jeff, I call bullshit on CoffeeScript. It saves you some characters, whoop-de-doo. I find it also saved me lines of code, and that's a different story. CoffeeScript is somewhat of a lightweight replacement for JavaScript. When you compile CoffeeScript to JavaScript, if you haven't done minification and compression, it's pretty readable JavaScript. It's almost line for line. So if you're afraid of switching to CoffeeScript because you can't switch back, you can. It's pretty simple to develop in CoffeeScript and then go and debug some JavaScript. Additionally, Chrome has, I forget the term for this, but Chrome has the ability, source maps, to let you debug CoffeeScript much more natively as though Chrome was literally interpreting CoffeeScript. Additionally, the CoffeeScript project also has a runtime interpreter so that you can do the CoffeeScript to JavaScript conversion at runtime and ship CoffeeScript to the browser, although I would not recommend it. Generally, you want to generate your JavaScript first and ship that. A couple things real quick about CoffeeScript. Probably the easiest sell is the callback syntax, the arrow. It's at the top right there. The arrow, the dash, greater sign, it stands in for function, parentheses, brace. And that's doesn't seem like much, but because it causes a new body, a new indentation, a new block of code, it's a lot closer to code blocks that are coming out for other languages, and so that's sort of compelling. The other thing is that, if you've noticed, it seems like there are no parentheses here. What's going on? Well, parentheses are mostly optional in CoffeeScript. They're occasionally necessary for eliminating ambiguity. You can put them in if you want, but you can remove them. Believe me, if you go from a world where you're required to use braces and parentheses to a world where you're not going to miss them. I'm just saying give it a chance, although I know many of you will not. I'm going to move right on. This is a more practical tool. The last couple tools were more language level. This is development level. This is development time CodeKit. I'm a big fan of it. I first got turned on to CodeKit because I had used less.app, which was originally one of the easiest ways, if you're developing on Mac, to convert less to CSS. Less, by the way, is sort of a competitor to Sass or SCSS. It's a CSS generator. CodeKit is neat because it supports just about everything I've talked about. It supports CoffeeScript to JavaScript conversion, Slim or Jade to HTML, and Sass, SCSS to CSS. It does it in real time. It monitors your file system. It has a lot of different options. It can generate, if you have blah.jade to blah.html in the same folder, or you can have separate folders, however you want to organize it. And it also has hooks for post-compilation steps. So that's a cool one. I haven't stopped for questions in a little bit. Yes, go ahead. Does it exist on Windows is the question. I'm not sure. Does anyone know? No. Are there any other good tools that anyone can recommend for Windows for monitoring, I guess, and compiling on the fly? Get a Mac. There are plenty of command line tools for this. The one I'm familiar with is Middleman. It's a cool static site generator. It builds on the world of Ruby. I've used it, but I don't consider myself a Ruby developer. It is sort of a development time server, automatically compiles all of the above that we've talked about, as well as a shipping time compiler, and I have no idea what that sound effect was. I was like the rim shot for time to move on to the next slide, maybe. Middleman is, you can check it out on, I think it's on GitHub. Knockout. It's more powerful than a right hook from this guy. Knockout is a competitor to, how many of you use, Batman or Ember or Backbone or something like that, or Knockout? So, right, we're somewhat framework obsessed these days. Here's why I don't like Knockout. It doesn't have routing. It's a known weakness. There's something called Knockback, which sort of bridges between the world of Knockout and Backbone. There's, I think, some other projects which add a few things to Knockout. Here's why I do like it. Knockout is a slightly different philosophical approach to data binding, which is one of the biggest strengths of all these frameworks we've talked about. If you're not familiar, the old way, which used to be new, but the old way was in using jQuery, do a selection, and then send some data into your UI elements, right? So you're executing code in JavaScript world. You've got objects, variables, data. You're sending them into UI objects, sending them into the DOM. Well, the issue frequently is that you start writing code that's organizing large pieces of UI and large DOM elements, and it gets brittle, and you're organizing things that are bigger than what you inherently think you're organizing. So the interesting thing about Knockout, it uses in the DOM these attributes, data-whatever, frequently data-bind, to tell that part of the DOM what JavaScript observable, and I'll define that in a second, but think of it as a variable, what JavaScript variable is going to be tied to this element. So later, instead of dealing with stacks of DOM elements, you're dealing with simple JavaScript arrays. You're dealing with simple objects, and they have already defined their mapping to these UI elements. So it's declarative, and while that's a little bit weird, notice, for instance, we have for each on the right side here in a unordered list element, and that's saying that everything inside is a template, which will be iterated at runtime based on an array that you have. So instead of writing a for loop in JavaScript code, you simply put the data into an array whose name is known here as people, and boom, we've got the ability now to automatically on the fly generate the UI elements. In this case, just to quickly define it, this span will be text colon name would be bound to each item in the for loop's name property. But it's, as some of you know, I'll get to you in a second, knockout is two-way. It's a binding that works both ways. So it works both for input, sending data into an observable, as well as you updating the observable based on a WebSocket or based on some code, and then updating the UI. I'll define an observable in a second, but first, question in the back.
Would that source be sent to the browser and then like knockout's a library that you import?
That's right.
That's runtime code. Browser, or is it like pre-processed or something?
It's not compile time, it's runtime. That's what the browser sees. What Knockout does when it starts up is it looks at the entire DOM and it searches for these things and finds them. And this is the cool part, it builds a dependency chain. And so as you create observables, an observable, if you want to define it, is sort of like a variable. It can hold data and you can also assign data into it, except it triggers code when you assign things into it, and that code can update things. The other thing is observables can depend on each other with the dependency chain. So it makes it really easy to say, you know, when this is updated, I want that to update too, but I don't want to write code to sync them in between. I can define with a simple functional style that this observable depends on that one with this function block, and then when this one updates, guess what? That one updates too, because when it executes the very first time, when it notices that this one in its code block calls and retrieves the value of this one, well, it builds a dependency chain from the one that was used into the one that's executing. Then when the one that was used updates, the one that's executing gets called to update as well. So this happens runtime in the browser. I think some of the other frameworks that I'm less familiar with have a similar mechanism, but not quite in this observable pattern. Is there anything else I wanted to mention about Knockout? Well, any other questions? Cool. Well, check it out. HeadJS. Who knows about HeadJS? Nobody.
It's like lab.
It's like lab? Okay. Got it. So if you are loading your JavaScript in the head in the old way, it was super slow, and you were told to load your JavaScript at the end, at the bottom of your document, and that's better. But this, or something like this, is best. This is an asynchronous JavaScript loading pattern, which starts loading JavaScript at the top of the document is where you would put this, but it doesn't block, and that's the difference, because your JavaScript is loading the rest of your JavaScript. So this would be a block of code of literal JavaScript that then would be executing while your style sheets, your HTML all loads. This would be grabbing your other JavaScript. So instead of your browser's HTML interpreter loading your JavaScript, which blocks, except occasionally for the async keyword that you can put, but that's newer and not necessarily, I think, supported by all browsers. But anyway, that would block in the old way. So this, or equivalent like lab.js ways of loading JavaScript from JavaScript in your head, is super fast. So check it out if you have not. Oh, the other thing this does is it lets you assign a callback or handler for specific modules once they have loaded to then execute some more code. So that's really nice because order of execution does matter, but you still want parallel download, parallel network loading of your JavaScript, so they're not waiting for each other, blocking, and then this one loads and then that one loads. So a summary of HeadJS is parallel download in order execution, which is what you want. Yes, question?
Have you made any comparisons this to Script.js?
Oh, Script.js, I'm not familiar. Can you summarize Script.js really quick?
It looks just exactly the same.
Okay, I haven't done a comparison. I imagine the mechanism's the same if it's fast. Question? Say it louder. Require.js. So require.js, I think, is inspired by AMD style. It's popular in Node, things like that. I haven't tried. I know that require.js has front-end browser versions of it. I imagine they're similar. That probably would be a better choice, especially if you have a Node stack, because then you have a very common pattern in your backend and your front end. So I like require.js from what I've seen. Any other questions? Yes?
You know that you can wait for the DOM to load before it activates the JS file?
Wait for the DOM to load. I guess the question is why exactly you would... Okay, wait for all the style sheets to load, is that what you mean?
No, like maybe you're setting some stuff up in one of your JS files, you want to wait for it to populate before you activate what you do.
I think just jQuery dot $document.ready will still work. I don't think you need to wait. Well, yes, if you want to wait, you can use the pattern I just mentioned. But frequently you don't want to wait because you want to execute code that's not necessarily UI specific. And you're talking about eliminating a flash of unstyled code and things like that. So I think maybe the best approach based on your question, I think might be making the styles turn all of your divs invisible at first, and letting this if you're going for the absolute fastest execution, turn all your styles to make all the divs and all the content invisible at first, and then let this code immediately, as soon as it runs, turn it back to visible. So it's a good question, though. Any others before I move on? Yes?
Does that have any impact on the perceived load as far as Google page speed is concerned? I mean, if you separate out all of the JS files rather than concatenating mid-file.
Definitely. Okay, so concatenation is a better approach in general. I think once you're concatenated, you still want to use an equivalent of this to load it at the head, but concatenation will always be faster. That's definitely true. This is a little more lightweight if you want to, if you haven't set up your whole asset assembly pipeline and you're using just sort of, I want to edit quickly, but I still want some speed, this works. But then if you have a good asset assembly pipeline and you're concatenating all your JavaScript, that will be the fastest.
You can also maintain cache for individual files using something like that. Whereas if you concat, the whole chunk has to get resent.
That is a great point. So what he's saying is that the alternative to the concatenate everything because it's faster is if you have one file that changes a lot and the rest do not. And in that case, based on HTTP caching, it might be faster to just update that one file that changes all the time. So it really depends on knowing about your code base and what changes. I'm going to move on to this tool, Proxino. This is JavaScript error gathering. So I'm a fan of cloud-based systems that sort of outsource a particular, a platform as a service or software as a service that outsource one particular problem. And for me, a big problem frequently is JavaScript errors happening that I'm not aware of on someone else's browser. And you can use this tool in order to gather them and know something about them. But there are better tools. I've recently been turned on to Rescue.js. I haven't made a slide for it. It's like yesterday, but that's a good one too. Yeah.
So that's like Airbreak for front end?
It's like Airbreak for JavaScript, yeah. Client-side JavaScript. Yeah, I think technically you could use this for Node, but there's better tools once you're on the server side, I think. I mean, the whole issue here is that it's executing on systems you don't know for sure all the details about, different browsers, different operating systems, all sorts of things. So that's why it's nice to have someone else gather them, because if you write your own error gatherer and you have a bug in that, then you might drop all the errors that you have. So I went through that and I realized I need to outsource my error gathering. Any other questions about this? Yes?
One of the winners of the Rails Rumble is Rescue.js, which is a very cool looking equivalent.
Yeah, I think I mentioned it a second ago. I like Rescue.js, and I have not used it, but it looks better than this, and it's probably going to be my favorite. I'm going to check that out for sure. Yes?
One thing that you have to worry about with Proxino is if you minify, the little errors that show up in here are not going to be too useful.
Yeah, I think you mean like line numbers and stuff?
Yeah, and also variable names.
And variable names for sure, yes. I think if your style is to do, one pattern you can use is to overload the console.log handler. I think it's window.onError, and then you give it a callback. And that way, if you're using a library that uses console.log to let you know about an error, or if you use that pattern, then you can, in one single step, capture all console logging into a system like this. So if you have nice, although this probably adds bloat, but if you're using console log with descriptive error messages, you can gather them that way. But you're right, minification and compression are going to definitely make it less debuggable, and you might need to just sort of use your own system of known error codes or something like that. Any other questions? Yes?
What's the overhead in influencing this?
The overhead in this? In implementing this? Very little. Yeah, it's one of those things where you can just set it up with a few lines in one spot and it will gather errors through the overloading those handlers. There's a little bit of cost. They have a free service and a it's a freemium model. But you don't have to decorate your code all over the place with change, if that's what you mean. Yeah. Did I answer your question? All right. Great. I'm going to move on. PubNub, better fan out. So this is an example of outsourcing a problem that I've had. If you wanted to reinvent, if you wanted to make app.net, you wanted to make an alternative to Twitter. Fan out is one of the trickiest problems because most of your users have just a few followers. Just distribute their messages in a for loop, maybe a parallel for. But what if you have your Paris Hilton or whatever? She's got millions of followers. That's a huge. That's a very write-heavy operation, and you can fall apart if you're not careful. I was involved with a startup that was doing real-time conversation, and the most popular conversations would fall apart because they were reinventing fan out. And so in my most recent startup, I decided to outsource fan out, and that's what PubNub does. They sort of have a chat room model. It would be nice if they had a more detailed follow a user sort of model, but this still works pretty well. Let me give you an example. You want to write an iPhone app, but you don't want a back end. There's a couple different services you can use, like Parse and other things. But if you really you need notification, real time, chat room style, and it needs to work at high scale, like millions of followers in just a lobby chat room, and you don't want it to break, this would be a good tool because that's what they specialize in, is that fan out. They do both it's basically a WebSocket or Socket.io connection under the hood, and it's bidirectional. It's publish, subscribe. It's real time. They also support like history, so if someone disconnects for a second and they come back, they will get it. That's one of the more recent developments, so it's not bulletproof, but I dig it. Any questions about PubNub? Any alternatives to PubNub that I might not be aware of? Pusher. Yep, Pusher is a good one. I think, does Pusher do iOS push, or is it mostly just HTML5? So Pusher is another one to check out. So another tool, Mixpanel. How many of you care about metrics? Vanity metrics, under the hood metrics. Mixpanel is a good solution for both. I'm going to talk just for a second on funnels. I don't want to turn all of you into salesmen, but if you have an idea and you're hoping it to be successful, this is a great tool. Now, a funnel is sort of a combination between a state machine and a simple just counter metric. So a funnel is both, it tracks state and it tracks counts. The point is, if you have a system where you need your users to give you their email address, sign up for free, and then later, based on the value of your system, sign up to pay, and several steps in the pipeline, guess what? At each step, you lose somebody. No matter how good your design is, it could be your design, it could be the speed of your site, it could be a bunch of different things, but you lose people. And so there's a yield, and it's never 100%. So you want to know what that yield is, and funnels are all about knowing the steps and then optimizing each step. For example, you might think that you're losing people in the last step, but actually you're losing them in the beginning step, and that step precedes the rest, so that step means you lose all of the other steps. Mixpanel is a great tool. It's a JavaScript library. You do one call, and it takes care of unique cookies to identify anonymous users correctly. It also then lets you tell it who that user is later when you figure out who they are, and backwards correlate it to that unique cookie that it created. It now has some really cool tools called Mixpanel Engage that just came out, where you can segment your users and say, all in their panel, I want to email all the users who went through this step, but not that step, and send them this email with a template. It's pretty cool. And down here you can see it has retention, which is, sure, people use this today, but did they use it a few days later? Some of you might be wondering, if you're really smart about growth hacking and this stuff, does it have cohort analysis? I don't think it has proper cohort analysis. Cohort analysis means looking at the behavior that people took based on all signing up at the same week. It's related to if you release a feature and then that feature seems to influence growth. Is it influencing growth of the new users or the old users? And that matters. So this is a cool tool to use. Has anyone used Mixpanel? Yeah? It's pretty cool. Are there any alternatives that are better or that I should mention? Yes? Oh, sure. Question.
Just
Oh, you were answering my, yeah. Kissmetrics, sure. Kissmetrics is one of the first. I think, does Kissmetrics have, like, compete with these visualizations and graphs? Cool, okay. Yep, question. Real cohort analysis. So if that's important to you, okay, just paid. Pay through the nose for cohorts, yes.
Does this support, does it inherently support A/B testing, like in reporting?
Good question. I've used it for A/B testing. I had to hack it a little bit. It's actually not that hard because their panel lets you do, I think, 2 or 3 different steps, like a Boolean. Like, given that the user went through this step, did they get to this step, or did they get to that step? And then you can see the percentages. I have done A/B testing with it. It wasn't hard, but it doesn't inherently support it. And A/B testing is great, but you also want to look at, like, A, B, C, D, E, F testing and lots of different, so it gets, there's probably better tools for that. But it excels. One other thing that I abused the system for was error gathering at first. I was tracking JavaScript errors with this. Problem is that Proxino is a lot cheaper than this is per data point. So I stopped doing that. Yeah, any other questions about Mixpanel? If you have a quick question about growth hacking or metrics or funnels, I can answer that too, but that's a little off. I'll stop using the term growth hacking. It's a little overdone. It is, yeah. You see job postings for growth hackers, yeah.
So you said Mixpanel, is that a paid like software as a service?
I mean, like almost everything out there, it's freemium. You can start using it for free, and then the cost is not too. I mean, it supports hundreds of thousands of data points with $10 to $50 a month.
It gets expensive really quick. Like,
Gets expensive if you grow.
turn it on, and you have a lot of users.
Yeah.
They'll like call you immediately.
Well, I mean, and here's, you're absolutely right. I mean, I started out just tracking actual user events that were, clicks and things, but then I went, I want to make a custom event that just fires once this DOM element loads, because I want to make sure it loads, but that was happening every single page load, so I wasn't anymore tracking user clicks, I was like triple tracking page loads, and I ran out of points really quick, so you do pay per data point.
Just happened to us the other day.
Yeah.
We got a bill from Kissmetrics that we're like, wow, what happened?
Yeah. I got one other metrics tool that I don't have a slide for, but I will mention. It became a favorite of mine. It's more for under the hood metrics. If you want to track your system's CPU, you want nice graphs where you can correlate and see, oh, the CPU went up there, but that was correlated with a spike in my database read rate. That's why that error happened. Check out Datadog. Datadog's cool because if you use a cloud service like I use Amazon Web Services, you give it your access key and your access secret, and you don't have to give it your root one. You can give it a sub user. If you don't know how about that, you can create sub users in Amazon Web Services with their own credentials. Anyways, you give it a credential that has access to CloudWatch. It automatically picks up just about every metric you would care about, and it graphs them. It's a lot cheaper. It doesn't do funnels because it's not based on growth hacking, but it does do great graphs with correlations like a dashboard. Datadog. It's really kick-ass for...
There's also New Relic.
New Relic. That's another really good one. Yeah. New Relic's... I haven't used it, but I've seen the videos.
New Relic's really the gold standard for performance monitoring, but not really metrics.
Right. Okay, so New Relic, I think, is known for your CPU, your network traffic, things like that. The more like hardware performance.
Yeah, it tells you like if something is going wrong. It's like it's not performing. You set a performance threshold,
right?
And we usually use it with air brakes together, so we know when air brakes and New Relic.
Oh, I like that.
Together.
New Relic with air brake. That's a great recipe. Cool. I'm going to move on. Live reload. If you haven't used it, it's very easy to explain. It is a shim in your operating system for local development that essentially knows where your development files are, knows when they get updated, and immediately reloads your browser. Not even a full page reload, but a fast reload of CSS. Can't do JavaScript, but for the HTML or the CSS, it's super fast. It's the fastest iteration you'll get for CSS unless you're using like a tool that's made for WYSIWYG CSS editing. So if you just want to throw up a browser, and I think live reload is definitely available for Chrome, Safari, probably the others, and you throw up a browser, throw up an editor, and as long as you configure it to know where your local code is, you can make changes to CSS. You press save, 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 save. It updates like that. So it's one of the fastest ways to iterate CSS if you want to use simple free tools.
If they don't
Yeah.
If they don't have an extension for this, because like I know it works on Safari, Chrome, and Firefox, they also give you a little JavaScript snippet that you can drop in the head, and so you can get it to work on like IE or whatever.
Oh, nice. So there's a JavaScript snippet that works for other browsers, and you don't even need the plugin. Any questions about live reload? Yes, in the back.
So CodeKit and live reload pretty much do the same thing. So which one do you prefer?
That's a good question, but it's not exactly that CodeKit and live reload do the same thing. CodeKit doesn't know about your browser. It's not refreshing your browser. CodeKit, yep. CodeKit does do that now?
In fact, that's the cool thing about live reload initially was that it injected the CSS without actually refreshing the whole browser. But now CodeKit does that too. I don't think it does it as well, but it still does it.
So apparently CodeKit does some of what live reload does, so that's a note for me to delete this slide. That's wonderful. No, and on a side note, quick tangent, it's wonderful to do this presentation for you guys because this is one of the most sophisticated groups. I'm not just stoking your egos, but this is one of the more sophisticated groups, certainly in Los Angeles. And I love the channel. I love that people know more about this shit than I do, so great. Yes?
Replace the slide with JS console. If you're doing any mobile development, it's a pain to track errors and stuff.
So there's a tool called JS Console. Can you summarize it real quick?
It's for mobile development. It's hard to get console logs on mobile. So you drop this in HeadJS, and it sends all the consoles to jsconsole.com so you can see what's going on the phone.
Great. Mobile JS Console. I love it. Yes?
How is it different from CodeKit?
So I think your question is related to his. From what I knew before this fellow mentioned it, CodeKit is about real-time recompiling your code when you're using generated languages where you've got some less and you want to make the CSS and you don't want to run a command every time. You can just save your less. CodeKit will notice it, generate the CSS, you're done. CodeKit, before I talked to this fellow, I didn't know that it knew about your browser, and so live reload was about noticing the new CSS and reloading your browser. Apparently CodeKit now does the full circle. Yes?
So I would say the main difference right now is that CodeKit can actually optimize your images for you, which live reload doesn't do that.
Optimize your what?
Images for you. Oh. And it can also concatenate JS files in whatever order you want.
Wow. So CodeKit's concatenating JS and optimizing your images. You mean image compression? Yes. And resizing? Cool. Yes?
And live reload, for example, you're using like push state with Ajax, stuff.
Right.
Like if you're ND, giving like a history, different Ajax, well, does it know like the live reload?
That's a weakness of live reload. It's not good at JavaScript. That's, to me, related to the basic problem of computability. So there's actually fundamental principles of computer science that stop that from working. There's no way it can inspect your JavaScript and know, oh, you edited this thing, then I'll just update that function. It gets really messed up. The thing about CSS is because of the way it's a declarative language that's got simple rules, it can update just one thing. But yeah, no, it's not going. It's going to get thrown off by a strange push state chain, as far as I know.
It will reload the page to that hash page.
Like for example, you have n numbers of like NDs within your application.
So like your URL like pound/bar, like it will reload that, and if your app is smart enough to recover from that state, it'll do an actual page reload when you edit.
Great. So even better, it will at least reload your current hash URL that you're at, or your push state URL. That's great. Awesome, guys. I told you there were 10. There's a few more. How am I doing on time? Okay. All right. I will bullet time. CodePen, it's like JS Fiddle, but it supports the other languages that I talked about, so you can code natively in Jade, Slim, CoffeeScript, Sass, less, just as cool as throwing up a JS Fiddle. WordMark, better font comparison. I believe it can use all your system fonts, or most of them, and you can quickly do comparison black on white, white on black, large sizes, small sizes. So it's a nice way to quickly pick fonts. That's wordmark.it, I think. It's got a strange top-level domain. Waypoints, if you're not familiar, Great way with jQuery to tie right into your scroll state, trigger a callback or function to happen when you get scrolled down to a certain part of the document. If you're a newspaper and you're wondering if people scroll below the fold and you have arguments all the time about, no, they're not going to want to wait below the fold. No, yeah, it's got to be above the fold. This is a way to see who gets below the fold or not. It also lets you choose values based on scrolling and all sorts of cool things. So waypoints.js. And then these last two slides are about sizing. Sizing text with specifics has worked for a while, but what if you just want the text to fill a arbitrarily sized div at runtime? That's what big text does, is another one. Well, fit text I think is the first one I found, but big text seems to do a few things better. So this is an easier way to do text sizing sometimes, especially large text sizing. And fit vid, this is another great tool if you are doing a mashup with YouTube or Vimeo and you want videos that are going to fit any size container and fluidly resize. FitVid.js is great at that. I think that's it. I just want to thank Carlo, Jason, everyone who runs this, JSLA, and all of you. And check me out. Check out Laughster. Thank you, guys.